The Portuguese had arrived in India in the 1400s, but this did not mean that they had the giant say-so in the nations. In fact, we know that by the 1500s, the people who ran India, parts of India, were the Mughals and other local kings. The fourth ruler of the Mughals, Jahandar, because the story revolves around him, saw many people coming from several places around the world. Obviously, initially the Persians who had taken over, then people from Arabia, Indonesia, and others who practiced their religion inside of India. Now, there are a lot of stories about who came and who didn't, but a group that is often left out is the Africans that made their way into the Mughal Empire. Now, obviously, we do not need evidence for something that is so self evident because we see CDs and all these other types of people in India. And we know that they fortified themselves in this very time. So, exactly why are there no writings about Africans who come from Africa specifically and named by name and name their kingdoms and lands? Well, the answer is there is. Remember, the kingdom of Darfur was growing at this time. Darfur had been established at the same time that the Portuguese had arrived in other parts of Africa. It was a Muslim empire and it had nothing to do with the Portuguese, but this shows that people were growing at that time. It wasn't necessarily that the Portuguese came and everything fell around it. This that we're going to read is about a Muslim man from Darfur. The sultans of Darfur in Sudan were well attested for. And because we already knew who they were, we know that this person who is mentioned here is not the king of those regions, even though he's credited that way. Instead, he's a powerful military ruler who was summoned by the Persians and the Muslims stationed in India, and he was brought there for military tactics. So, as we read, Khan was promoted to the rank of 1,500 personnel and 800 horse. Feridun Khan Barlas was promoted to the rank of 2,500 with 2,000 horse. 1,000 tolka of gold and silver and 1,000 rupees were given in alms on the day of the procession of the sun into the constellation of the Scorpion, which, according to the general acceptation of the Hindus, is called the Sankrat. On the 10th of that month, an elephant was presented to Shah Beg Yuzi, the panther keeper, and Salamu Allah the Arab, who is a distinguished young man and a relative son-in-law of Mubarak, the ruler of Darfur. On account of some suspicion that Shah Abbas had entertained against him, he came to wait upon me. I patronized him and gave him the rank of 400 personnel and 200 horse. Again, another force containing 193 mansabdars and 46 ahadis I sent after Parwez for service in the Deccan. 50 horses were also entrusted to one of the servants of the court to convoy to Parwez. As this was already the 1500s, two things happened that made sure that things would change forever. One, military had upgraded. People were bringing in bombards and guns in higher numbers that have ever been brought to these regions, both in Sudan, in Darfur, and in the Mughal Empire. Suddenly, wars wouldn't be fought by clashing together pieces of metal. Now, what else changed? Well, too many things changed to mention, but the biggest one is that racially, no civilization would be pure anymore in the sense that it would not have one race. So Darfur had some Arabs and it also had some black Africans. In fact, the leader of Darfur was known that his mother was an Arab, which is why he was given that name in the beginning. And then later, the Mughals, or earlier, the Mughals, had also been mixing with the local population. And this was basically the fate of these two lands. They became Muslim and they had mixed populations, which you can still see to this day. Sudan in previous centuries was popular for its female warriors, but at this time that had all decayed, and because of their deep Muslim heritage and their deep Muslim conversion, they became the same as other Muslim states. Now it is known that Darfur did not fall to the people of Arabia, instead, it governed itself. It was instead a pure African population in the sense that these people were free. They were rewarded handsomely for joining the Brotherhood and allowing themselves to fight on the side of the Muslims in India. As we read, I gave him a yak tail, standard. I appointed Fida Khan, who was one of my faithful servants, and to whom I gave a robe of honor and a horse and his expenses, promoting him to the rank of 1,000 personnel and 400 horse, original and extra, to go with Khan Jahan, in order that if it were necessary to send anyone to Adil Khan, according to his request, he might dispatch him. Lanku Pandit, who in the time of the late King Akbar had came with offerings from Adil Khan, I also gave leave to go with Khan Jahan, bestowed on him a horse, a robe of honor, and money of the amirs and soldiers who had been appointed with Abdu Illah Khan to the duty of beating back the Rana men such as Raja Bir Singh, Dio Shajat Khan, Raja Bikramajit, and others with 4,000 and 5,000 horse were nominated to support Khan Jahan. I sent Mutamad Khan with the announcement that I had made him a Sazawal, and that was to act along with Khan Jahan in Ujan. Out of the men of that palace, I sent 6,000 or 7,000 horse with him, such as Saif Khan Badha, Haji B. Uzbeg, Salumi, Allah, Arab's brother, son of Mubarak, Arab, who had in his possession the province of Jutra and Darfur, and that neighborhood, and other Mansabdar and courtiers. At the time of giving them leave, I gave each one an increase of rank and robe of honor and money for their expenses, making Muhammad beg pay master for the army. I provided him with 1,000,000 rupees to take with him. I sent to Parwez a special horse, and to the Kankanan and other emirs and officers who were appointed to that shabar dresses of honor. After carrying out these matters, I left the city for the purpose of hunting. Now, it's important to state why I am saying that Mubarak was not in charge of Darfur, even though he is written there as a ruler of Darfur, because of course we know the ruler of Darfur is Suleiman Solong. And we know that Jahangir lived at the same time as Suleiman Solong. In fact, Suleiman Solong was born before Jahangir and died after Jahangir, meaning that there's no opportunity for there to be someone else. Instead, he's thought to be a noble of some rank. At this time, there were two main people who existed at that place. The majority were the Fur tribes, which had always existed prior, which is where Darfur gets its name from, the Fur tribes that were there. And then obviously there was some Arabs. We know that Suleiman Solong, which is last name Solong, we know that he must have had a Arab mother. Now, whether she was fully Arab or not is unknown, but she was at least partially of Arab descent. We know that Jahangir was definitely partially of Middle Eastern descent. The ambitions of everyone at this time were bigger than any of the stories that could be recounted by India or Africa alone. Also, the introduction that led to suspicion of people like the Portuguese had started unions outside of what had previously existed, where, of course, there was a loose connection of Middle Eastern unifiers under Islam. Now it seemed like they had the Christian threat at their door. But unlike previous times where they were fully hostile, it seems like the Mughal Empire allowed some Jesuits to practice within their kingdoms. They were not very good at converting the Muslims at that place, but it didn't matter because at least they had the footing in there. Suleiman, who was a Muslim, did not fully represent the true history of the fur people because we know the fur people were actually not even Christian before this. They seem to have worshipped the natural or the older gods that had existed prior. In other words, what I guess Europeans call paganism, but in real life it's animism. Now, there's some information that I left out when I was talking about this sentence. So let's go and reread the last part that is necessary in understanding Darfur. As he says here, on the 10th of that month, an elephant was presented to Shah Beg Yuzi, the panther keeper, and Salum Allah, the Arab, who is a distinguished young man and a relative, son in law, of Mubarak, the ruler of Darfur. So separate instantly Mubarak and Saluma Allah. The reason why he could do this was because, of course, this, as you saw with the original leader of Darfur, they were not against intermarrying with Arabs. You see here, he's being intermarried with an Arab, at least the child, probably a daughter, of Mubarak from Darfur is being married to an Arab, which is why he could be summoned. And then another thing, now you will notice that immediately the thing that jumps out at us is that there are places that are mentioned which are unknown. For example, Jutia. But according to some European scholars, Jutia is actually a mistake, or it's how they pronounce Joanna, which might be the Comoros Islands. And so, because the Sudanese at one time were in charge of the Comoros Islands, it's thought that when they say right Jutia, they're not talking about any state inside of India. So if you read Brothers, son of Mubarak Arab, who had in his possession the province of Jutra, probably talking about the Comoros, and Darfur, which today has been accepted as Darfur in Sudan, is being brought, and this person is showing off. You see how he's like, I provided him with 1,000,000 rupees to take him with him, and blah 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 blah. So, and then I gave him some cloths and sub dresses of honor. So there is a level of showing off about this, getting unnecessarily far away people to come and help. We know that in Darfur, because the rulers were local, they actually allowed the practice of what would be called paganism, or in the language of the Arabs, the Kafirs, they would be allowed to continue to practice a lot of their religions until, of course, there was a change of power and Islam was further cemented. This is long after the death of both of the kings that I mentioned. Once that had been established, more and more kingdoms, even within Africa, well, mostly within Africa, were encouraged to move inside of Darfur and places like that. But these Muslims were converted, and Darfur was one of the strongest black empires or black kingdoms that existed at this time. Now, it was nowhere near some of the bigger, stronger ones, but it still had a thing. And it would only be later in the 1800s. Think about it. It was founded in the 1500s. Actually, it's thought to founded earlier, but let's go with the historical date in the 1500s. And it fell in the 1800s, or at least it was conquered by foreigners from the 1800s. If we use the example of the Comoros, we can see that just because you're mixed, it does not mean that you are not black. The Comoros Islands has always had some level of Arab movement since the Arabs started moving. One of the biggest ones was the sultans of Oman, who came with great influence in these regions. By the 1600s, which, if you remember, was about the same time that this story took place, the main people, the black Africans, were trying their best to push off foreign influences like the Portuguese, the sultans, and all of that. And of course, this worked to some degree, and we do know that today, foreigners did win, but this was only later. They ruled their own lands for quite a number of years, centuries really. And so, to bring it back to the original story and close it out, we see great influence going for hundreds of years. Black African Muslim states communicating with Indian/Arab states. And finally, we see a fall of these kingdoms, not because they were weak, not because of any of that, but because there was a huge change happening. I mean, these people were modern. These civilizations were modern. These civilizations were up to date with every other civilization in the 1600s. I just want to cement that for you.